An ancient knight of Zamor, locked in the Weeping Everjail, curiously drops an item, Radagon's Scarseal. Understanding the why will lead us to a profound insight, as Radagon was a fire giant. Radagon's Scarseal is a reflection of Zamor's victory against the fire giants, particularly in this case, Radagon himself, who fiercely defended his people against America's genocide, if you will. Armor worn by Knights of Zamor, hailed as heroes in the war against the giants. These long-lived warriors, clad in biting, freezing winds, are said to have been the mortal enemies of the fire giants since time immemorial. In the Chinese 1.0 description, Radagon is directly referred to as a fire giant without any ambiguity, unlike the Giant's Braid description. A magic sword forged to celebrate Renala's wedding, the cold crystal that symbolizes the Queen of Raya, and the giant fire that symbolizes Radagon. They reside in the blades on both sides. Hefty whip woven from the flame-red hair of a fire giant. Every giant is red of hair, and Radagon was said to have despised his own red locks. Perhaps this was a curse of their kind. When you take into account the red braid description, which is currently in-game, it only strengthens the thesis. Radagon was of fire giant origins who fought with this exact Zamor, currently imprisoned in the Weeping Peninsula, to defend his brethrens. As the war against the giants was a critical moment in history where Zamors were able to push back against the giants with the help of Godfrey and Marika. As a result of their congealed strength, they won, but not without some serious resistance from the champion Radagon, who pushed back against Marika. After all, the fire giants were his family, his kin. He wasn't gonna let Marika murder them all just because she wanted to be a patron goddess. Unfortunately, Radagon and the fire giants lost the battle as Zamors were aided by Godfrey's strength, which is when this imprisoned Zamor gathered Radagon's Scarseal as a memento of her victory, just like how we got it in the aftermath of our duel. Ice sorcery of the town of Zamor. Cloaked in icy tempest, the Knights of Zamor have challenged the fire giants since ancient times. If you want to understand exactly how Radagon was separate from Marika at this point in time, or how he could support the fire giants, and why he would do that in the origin timeline, then you need to watch my Origins of Marika and Radagon lore analysis, as I explain everything there. How Radagon's hatred and vengeance for what Marika did to her giant brothers, fueling the Castle Morn rebellion, giving evidence with the brick hammer and various other item descriptions to strengthen the analysis. But before we move forward, I want to explain how Radagon's Scarseal could even exist at this point in time in the first place. When Marika ascended to godhood at the Gate of Divinity, she was one with Radagon in a single body, just as we observe in the final confrontation. If you listen carefully to the trailer, Elden Beast's theme plays in the background, and Marika is reinforcing the Rune of Life, as evidenced by the opposite, being the Rune of Death. Their arcs at the top are completely opposite, meaning Marika is imbuing the life-reinforcing Elden Ring into her flesh at this point in time. As Miyazaki said, this is the land in which Marika became a god. So how did she do this? As evident by a soundtrack, Elden Beast is now being embodied inside Marika and Radagon's flesh. They both were two parts of a god, the sulfur and mercury, the gold and silver. And because of this, their lifelong duties were set in stone for both of them. Maybe a curse of divinity that would imprison them, as Saint Trina would like to say. An eye engraved with an Elden rune, said to be the seal of King Consort Radagon. These seals represent the lifelong duty of those chosen by the gods. Now, both Marika and Radagon were chosen by the gods, but as it turns out, Marika needed to murder all the fire giants to birth her earth tree, glistening with life, as a tree can't grow in an environment where the fire exists, which is evident by the Smithing Stone 7 description. The earth tree was birthed after the Giants' War, and did not exist in a time period where the Giants' Forge was burning with intensity. Marika literally needed to win this war if the Golden Order was to be the dominant theocracy. However, Radagon, as much as he loved Marika, couldn't allow a genocide of his fire giant brothers. She was going too far, guided by the unhinged Mother of Fingers, Meteor. Unable to accept this, Radagon and Marika's relationship was now at a crossroads. They split as two persons and two bodies. Radagon was going to take a serious stance against Marika as his own person with his values intact. Meanwhile, Marika was not particularly bothered, as she already had a strong king consort Godfrey she could associate with. Considering the trolls and the Zamors were going to aid in their army, the victory was all but assured. And right around this moment, we come back to this Zamor in Weeping Peninsula, who bested Radagon with Marika's help, acquired this Radagon Scarseal as a memento of her victory. Remember, Radagon was just like Marika, partly a god, inheriting the Elden Ring into his flesh at the Gate of Divinity. Just like Marika had her own Sourseals and Scarseals, well, so did Radagon. We can safely make this conclusion because Marika says to Godfrey to brandish the Elden Ring and win the Giants' War, which implies its existence and consequently Marika's godhood at the Gate of Divinity. Put the giants to the sword and confine the flame atop the mount. Let a new epoch begin, an epoch glistening with life. Brandish the Elden Ring for the age of the Earth Tree. So this quote confirms how the Gate of Divinity and the Elden Ring's existence predates the war with the giants, explaining again how Radagon's Scarseal could exist at this point in time. Now, this was a short summary for people who are not familiar with the ins and outs of the origin lore. However, this analysis will focus on exactly how the Zamor here was able to gather Radagon's Scarseal. And as a result, I will explain at the end of the video how and why the Zamor here was imprisoned in the Weeping Peninsula above all else. Zamors were their elemental opposite. They were locked in a timeless war with the fire giants, in a stalemate of sorts. What happened exactly that gave the advantage, tipping the scales? This advantage was something the fire giants lacked: losing battles while winning the war. Before Marika and Godfrey arrived on the scene, Zamors must have felt like everyone around them is a strategist angling for power, all trying to promote their own interests, often at their expense. Trolls, giants, beasts, the fell god, dragons, you name it. Zamors were just one of the pawns in the chessboard, trying to carve a place for themselves in this world. Though lacking in pure strength, Zamors had one advantage over the fire giants: their high intelligence, as alluded with the Ice Storm requirements, needing a whopping 36 intelligence to use. Winning the war is the art of looking beyond the battle and calculating ahead. You consider the political ramifications and long-term consequences of what you do. Instead of reacting emotionally to people, you take control and make your actions more dimensional, subtle, and effective. Let others get caught up in the twists and turns of the battle, relishing their little victories. As Zamors did, winning the war will bring you the ultimate reward, the last laugh. Even though the fire giants were strong and posed a fierce opposition to the Zamors since time immemorial, a political alliance with Godfrey and Marika and the Trolls all but assured their victory. Zamors might have lost the battles, but they won the war. And how they've accomplished this is elegantly illustrated in the history of war.
I'm going to Vietnam, and I'm bringing a beer!
In 1967, the leaders of the American war effort in Vietnam thought they were finally making progress, as they had launched a series of operations to search out and destroy the Viet Cong, North Vietnamese soldiers who had infiltrated South Vietnam and had come to control much of its countryside. These guerrilla fighters were elusive, but the Americans had inflicted heavy losses on them in the few battles that they managed to force them that year. The new South Vietnamese government, supported by the Americans, seemed relatively stable, which could help to win the approval among the Vietnamese people. To the north, bombing raids had knocked out many of North Vietnam's airfields and heavily damaged its air force. Although massive anti-war demonstrations had broken out in the United States, polls show that most Americans supported the war and believed that the end was in sight, since the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army had proved rather ineffective in head-to-head battle against the might of American firepower and technology. The strategy was to somehow lure them into a major engagement. That would be the turning point of the war, and by the end of 1967, intelligence indicated that the North Vietnamese were about to fall into such a trap. Their commander, General Giap, was planning a major offensive against the US Marine outpost at Ca San. Apparently, he wanted to repeat his greatest success, the battle at Dien Bien in 1954, in which he had defeated the French army, driving the French out of Vietnam for good. Ca San was a strategic outpost. It was located a mere 14 miles from the demilitarized zone that separated North from South Vietnam. It was also 6 miles from the border of Laos, site of a stretch of the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, the North Vietnamese supply route to the Viet Cong in the south. General William Westmoreland, the overall US commander, was using the Ca San to monitor enemy activity to the north. Dien Bien Phu has served a similar role for the French, and Giap has been able to isolate and destroy it. Westmoreland would not allow Giap to repeat that feat. He built well-protected airstrips around Ca San, ensuring full use of his helicopters in control of the air. He called up substantial number of troops from the south to the Ca San area, just in case he needed them. He also ordered 6,000 additional Marines to reinforce the outpost. But a major attack on Ca San was nothing he wanted to discourage. In frontal battle, the enemy would finally expose itself to severe defeat. In the first few weeks of 1968, all eyes were on Ca San. The White House and the US media were certain that the decisive battle of the war was about to begin. Finally, at dawn of January 21, 1968, the North Vietnamese army launched a vicious assault. As both sides dug in, the battle turned into a siege. Soon after the engagement began, the Vietnamese were to celebrate their Lunar New Year, the holiday called Tet. It was a period of revelry, and in time of war it was also a traditional moment to declare a truce. This year was no different. Both sides agreed to halt the fighting during Tet. Early on the morning of January 21st, the first day of the new year, reports began to trickle in from all over the South Vietnam. Virtually every major town and city, as well as the most important American bases, had come under Viet Cong attack. An army general tracking the assault pattern on a map said it resembled a pinball machine lighting up with each raid. Parts of Saigon itself had been overrun by enemy soldiers, some of whom had managed to blow their way through the wall of the US Embassy, the very symbol of the American presence in Vietnam. Marines regained control of the embassy in a bloody fight, which was widely seen on American television. The Viet Cong also attacked the city's radio station, the presidential palace, and the Westmoreland's own compound at the Ton Son Nhut Air Base. The city quickly descended into street fighting and chaos. Outside Saigon, provincial cities too came under siege. Most prominent was the North Vietnamese capture of Hue, the ancient Vietnamese capital and a city revered by Buddhists. Insurgents managed to take control of virtually the whole city. Meanwhile, the attacks on Khe Sanh continued in waves. It was hard for Westmoreland to tell what the main target was. Were the battles to the south merely a means of drawing forces away from the Khe Sanh, or was it the other way around? Within a few weeks, in all parts of South Vietnam, the Americans regained the upper hand, retaking control of Saigon and securing their air bases. The sieges at Hue and Khe Sanh took longer, but massive artillery and air bombardments eventually doomed the insurgents, as well as leveling the entire sections of Hue. They had suffered terrible casualties, far more than the Americans had. In fact, the entire Viet Cong infrastructure had been wiped out. They would never recover. At long last, the enemy had revealed itself and had been badly mauled. The Americans thought that Tet had been a tactical disaster for the North, but another weak point began to trickle in from home. The drama at the US Embassy, the siege of Hue, and the attacks on air bases had kept millions of Americans glued to their television sets. Until then, the Viet Cong had operated mostly in the countryside, barely visible to the American public. Now, for the first time, they were apparent in major cities, wreaking havoc and destruction. Americans had been told that the war was winding down and winnable. These images said otherwise. Suddenly, the war's purpose seemed less clear. How could South Vietnam remain stable in the face of this ubiquitous enemy? How could the Americans ever claim a clear victory? There really was no end in sight. American opinion polls tracked a sharp turn against the war. Anti-war demonstrations broke out all over the country. President Lyndon Johnson's military advisors, who had been telling him that the South Vietnam was coming under control, now confessed that they were no longer so optimistic. In the New Hampshire Democratic primary that March, Johnson was stunned by his defeat by Senator Eugene McCarthy, who had galvanized the growing anti-war sentiment. Shortly after, Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election in the upcoming presidential race and that he would slowly disengage American forces from Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was indeed the turning point in the Vietnam War, but not in the direction that Westmoreland and his staff had foreseen. See, for the American strategists, the success of the war depended mostly on the military. By using their army, their superior weaponry, to kill as many Viet Cong as possible and to regain control of the countryside, they would ensure the stability of the South Vietnamese government. Once the South was strong enough, North Vietnam would give up the fight. However, the North Vietnamese saw the war very differently. By nature and practice, they viewed conflict in much broader terms. They looked at the political situation in the South, where American search and destroy missions were alienating South Vietnamese peasants. The North Vietnamese, meanwhile, did everything they could to win the peasants over and earned for themselves an army of millions of silent sympathizers. How could the South be secure when the Americans had failed to capture the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese farmers? The North Vietnamese also looked to the American political scene, where in 1968 there was to be a presidential election. And they looked at the American culture, where support for the war was wide but not deep. The Vietnam War was the first televised war in history. The military was trying to control information about the war, but the images on the television spoke for themselves. On and on, the North Vietnamese went continually broadening their outlook and analyzing the war's global context. And out of this study, they crafted their most brilliant strategy, the Tet Offensive. Using their army of peasant sympathizers in the south, they were able to infiltrate every part of the country, smuggling in arms and supplies under the cover of the Tet holiday. The targets they hit were not only military but televisual. Their attacks in Saigon, base of most of the American media, Hue and Khe Sanh were also places heavily covered by American reporters. They also struck symbolic locations, embassies, palaces, air bases, you name it. They would suck in media attention. On television, all this would create the dramatic and deceptive impression that the Viet Cong were everywhere, while American bombing raids and pacification programs had gotten nowhere. In effect, the goal of the Tet Offensive was not a military target, but the American public in front of its televisions. Once Americans lost faith in an election year, the war was doomed. The North Vietnamese did not have to win a single pitched battle on the field, and in fact they never did. But by extending their vision beyond the battlefield to politics and culture, they won the war. I hope you can see where I'm getting at. Just like the advantage Zamors had against the fire giants with a strategic political alliance. In life, we always tend to look at what is most immediate to us, taking the most direct route towards our goals, and trying to win the war by winning as many battles as we can. We think in small micro-level terms and react to present events, but this is a petty strategy. Nothing in life happens in isolation. Everything is related to everything else and has a broader context. That context includes people outside of your immediate circle, whom your actions affect. The public at large, the whole world, it includes politics. For every choice in modern life has political ramifications. It includes culture, the media, the way the public sees you. Your task as a grand strategist is to extend your vision in all directions, not only looking further into the future, but also seeing more of the world around you. As this way, you will be able to harness the relationships between events, one battle setting up the next. You will bring the war to arenas your enemies have ignored. Zamors, unlike the fire giants, were able to read the room, see the moving parts of the war better. They have adapted to their political environment and prevailed. After all, Radagon leading the giants was emotionally charged with a desire to survive, with a desire to protect, a primitive emotion filled with hatred and vengeance against America and Godfrey. This admittedly relatable motivation made him unable to see that he was fighting an unwinnable war. That vengeance was going to fuel Radagon's Castle Morn rebellion down the line, as the mistreatment of misbegottens at Castle Morn was undeniably similar to the conquest of the giants. Maybe this could be the redemption Radagon needed after being powerless against America, not being able to save his giant brothers. As to why this Zamor wasn't killed but imprisoned here, the answer is simple. Radagon, while not knowing this Zamor stole his Scarseal, he knew who she was. After all, the champion Radagon was bested by her. After Godfrey was hounded from the lands between and Radagon became the second Elden Lord to Queen Marika, he ordered this Zamor to be found and imprisoned in a location he is very familiar with as a punishment, in an Everjail in Weeping Peninsula, where he led the Castle Morn Rebellion, the place where Radagon fought for justice, as it was only fair. And this is a tale that I've analyzed extensively in the Origin Timeline video. Feel free to check it out if you want to hear more. Furthermore, I want to point out that games like Elden Ring are rare. From Software simply can't pump out games like this each year like Call of Duty. So meanwhile, you might want to check out other Souls-likes. Black Myth Wukong came out recently, and I plan to talk about it on the channel, but unless you have a strong PC, you won't be able to see truly what Unreal Engine 5 has to offer. This is a beautiful game, and From Software games coming out in the future will only push the envelope, which is why, if you're looking for one, Chat Computers is selling an affordable RTX 4060 laptop with excellent customer support right now. If you're interested, the link is in the description. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Click the bell because my next video will be very interesting and I wouldn't want you to miss out on it. As always, thanks for watching and I will see you in the next one.